Where do you find God? Almost sounds like a loaded question, doesn't it? I mean, if God was someone you could find, wouldn't everyone be out searching? Well, rather than looking for something elusive, like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I reckon it's more about learning to recognise the way God is already present to us in our everyday lives. I'm Lizzie Oakes, and this is Where Do You Find God? My guest on the podcast today is Tim Sisarich. Now, Tim has been part of the Rima Media whānau for over 27 years. In that time, he's been a news director, a radio host. He's probably done a bunch of other things too. And these days fills in for us radio announcers when we're off air. Tim has over 2 decades of experience of working alongside humanitarian organisations, 3 decades in strategic communication. He's married with 5 kids, and in my brief description, I feel I've probably just touched the tip of the iceberg on the life of Tim. Welcome to Where Do You Find God, Tim Sisarich.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tim, your life sounds very full. What do you do to relax?
I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of questions you'd ask me, actually, and thinking make sure I need to tie in God into all of those things so that I sound like I'm a really together guy. But I really try and spend as much time as I can walking with my wife and making sure that we defrag. I have an Australian cattle dog, and so he requires a lot of walking. So we do morning walks and evening walks, and it's actually really interesting because that is probably a nice segue into a question of where I find God. I really do find God in those moments when I'm talking to people who I care about and who care for me, and we start engaging on issues or unloading or defragging.
Yeah.
So that's my relax. The walking is the relax.
Yeah, defragging is good. And you just touched on an Aussie dog. I know you're in Australia, and you guys are quite close to the beach, I take it?
Yeah, we are quite close to the beach.
Yay.
And so that's it, and the sea air does wonders.
Yes,
so we feel very, very blessed where that's concerned.
You're speaking my language. I love the beach. I'm not too far from it as well. Maybe not quite as close as you, but I love it. So, Tim, in Acts chapter 17, verse 27, it says, God intended that they would seek him and reach out for him, though he be not far from each one of us. So my question for you today is, Tim, where do you find God?
Well, let me walk it back a little bit. When I was a kid, I grew up in a home that I'm the youngest of 5, but I was the first into a Christian home. And so my experience was that God was sort of always there. My dad was involved in deliverance ministry, working with Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship, Prison Fellowship, all of those types of things. So God was always part of our existence. And when I was 4, I said to God, to my parents, I really want to know God and I want to speak in tongues.
Wow.
So when I was 4, I intentionally went through that process. But during that time of growing up in a Christian home and experiencing all those things, I fell into what I would say is the Christian process. So finding God was I had to be in church on Sunday. I had to be reading my Bible every day. I used to read Keith Green's book about 4 times, and he'd say things like, I started out wanting to pray for an hour and I think, okay, I'm going to be like Keith Green. So I would try and find God in all those places. But about 20 years ago, my wife and I ended up in Israel, and we went because we felt God had called us to the people of Israel, Palestine, to let our light so shine before them that they'd see our good works and glorify God. About 6 months into it, I said, God, I don't know what's going on here. All the things that I've always done to try and connect with you just seem empty. And long story short, I said, I don't even think I know you anymore. And I felt very clearly God say to me, finally, now you and I can actually get to know each other.
Love that.
And so over the past 20 years, I think I would say that my finding God has really evolved from the stock standard, which, by the way, is not bad or wrong. And that is an amazing way for people to connect with God. But for me, I find it in there's a song by Rihanna and Eminem. And just recently I was listening to that song. It's full of swear words and it's just a full-on song. And I found myself in tears because God started speaking to me in it. So I found God in that song. A few years back, I was having a really, really tough time going through just trying to figure out what God wanted us to do. You gave that little introduction of me, but, when you're working in that space, you're always hustling for work or et cetera. And someone said to me, Tim, I know that you're struggling. I'm going to be the one who carries you. And he sent me a playlist of songs, and I'd listen to the songs. They wouldn't. And then all of a sudden, there was another song that just popped up in there random. And God went, I'm speaking to you. And so I guess I find God in some random places, whether it's standing on the beach, whether it's listening to a song, whether it's engaging with someone like you and I right now are. So I guess for me, finding God is quite is not a profound thing. It's noticing him in the small and in the big, in the breathing of life. So I love to spend time with God. I love to spend time journaling, but it's in the everyday bits and pieces where you catch something and you go, oh my gosh, that's God speaking to me.
Yeah.
I don't feel that's very profound. And as I said to you, I really wanted to have something profound, but I just think if we're looking for God in the everyday, that we tend to find him there.
Yeah. No, you're speaking my language. I think when I was younger, probably back in my 20s of, thinking, there was a big noisy service and there was all the smoke machines. And like you, not saying that those things are bad, but, and you and I are probably a similar sort of age, it's just that, like you were saying, I love just writing in my journal and sensing him responding. And like you say, being at the beach and all those things, like, recognizing him. And it's like in the busyness of music, right? There's the pause, and you got to take the pause in life so that you can connect with God. This God that you find that you talked really maybe, I don't know if putting words to it, if you would call it a deconstruction of your faith, that it looks quite different now than it did. This God that you find there, what's he like?
So I went to some counseling a wee while back, and as part of that counseling, I was sort of taken on a mental journey through a Christian counselor. And I saw this picture of me. I grew up in Fiji, and I saw this picture of me, young me, sitting outside my garage. And I was just sort of playing playing on the ground there, and there was someone with me. And as I looked, I realized it was Jesus.
Wow.
And I actually, when I was 10, won an award for the whole school for a speech on my best friend, which was Jesus. So to sum that up, for me, I have a very real sense that God is my best friend. Yes, I'm in awe of the amazingness of God, the creation of God. I love the science, when you start looking at science and realizing that God is behind all of that, and history and how he pulls the threads together of people's lives, even for you and I to come together like this. That's profound, right? So in all of that profoundness, there's this relationship that I'd have that for me is intimate. Where I feel that I can tell him I'm not feeling happy, where I feel that he can tell me the same thing. And so for me, it's deeply personal. And I would really love too that people understood that they realize that God can be their best friend, that they can be intimate with him in that way. You talked about deconstruction of faith, and I know that that's a kind of I suppose, as you say, people of our age, we grew up in the sort of the charismatic movement, and we grew up with the smoke machines and the ripped jeans and all of those things. And then we suddenly start reading the Desert Fathers or something, and we go, actually, I really want that. So I would really say that while that might be good for me, or that might be good for you, when I talk to my mum about this stuff, she really just loves what we would talk as the really simple relationship with God that she grew up with in the 80s and 90s. She doesn't want to deconstruct it and go really deep. She says she loves it when I talk about it, but that's not for her.
Yeah.
And so if I was to leave anybody with something profound, it is that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So I'm not creating a God that is just whatever you want it to be. But God made you, and he made me, and he gave us the personalities and the brains and the insights into life the way he's given it to us. And because God made that, for me, that means that God wants to experience us or engage us in the way in which he's designed us, not to try and force us into a box, but he actually wants to step in and live in our environment. He loves us for who we are, not who we should be, to quote Brennan Manning, who, by the way, is my favorite author, but he loves us for who we are. And so I would say, find God in who you are. Don't try and find God in somebody else's box.
Amen. Tim Sisarich, thank you for joining me today on Where Do You Find God?
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
If you'd like to listen again, tune in to Sanctuary on Wednesdays at 1:30 p.m. or listen and subscribe via your favourite podcast app and give us a review so other people can find us.